This presentation was recorded at MVCConf. For more content like this, go to www.mvcconf.com. JetBrains, the leading vendor of professional development tools, now offers a range of new products for .NET developers. In addition to ReSharper, the top-class productivity extension for Visual Studio, you can now use .cover to run coverage analysis for your applications, .trace to find performance bottlenecks, and use TeamCity and UTrack for a perfect combination of continuous integration and issue tracking software. Go to www.jetbrains.com for more information.
My name is Eric Sowell. I am a developer within Dallas, working at Match.com. On Twitter, I am the @Maliak, and email is eric.sowell@gmail.com. Feel free to contact me at any later point if you have any questions or want to have a follow-up conversation about any of the stuff that we're talking about today. So feel free to do that. So the title of this, if I remember right, is Making Apps Testable. Of course, this is MVCconf, and so we're really talking about making ASP.NET apps, and specifically ASP.NET MVC apps testable. So that's what we're discussing today. Some of you might have visited my other session earlier today. I told you I was going to cover some stuff. It is on my schedule to cover it, so let's see what we can do. And as I said a few minutes ago, if you have any questions at any point, just let me know. If you have a microphone, I don't mind if you even jump on the microphone. And just to confirm that you can still hear me, somebody say, hey, I can hear you, either through Q&A or microphone. I don't really like talking to myself very much, so. Okay, everybody can hear me, so let me clear those out. You can also stop telling me that you can hear me. All right. Hi there, and got it. Okay. Now, let's talk about making ASP.NET apps testable. All right, let's go to the next slide. So let's just go ahead and get started. There are some things about ASP.NET MVC that there's some basic concepts that you need to understand to really get the most out of this framework and what it has done for making web apps built on the Microsoft platform more easy to test. First of all, for all intents and purposes, you don't really have the page lifecycle. Now, it still happens because we're running on traditional old ASP.NET ultimately under the covers. But from an ASP.NET MVC perspective, you don't have page load, you don't have page init, you don't have button-click event handlers and your code behind for your ASPX page. All of those things make it a little more difficult to make your apps testable. In MVC, they've pretty much gotten rid of that bit, and so that's kind of nice. Now, there is a life cycle in terms that there's a request life cycle that things happen in, but for the most part, for your testing, you don't need to worry about it. So that's kind of fantastic. Second, one thing that is very different when writing, at least in terms of the original intent of the code, when writing ASP.NET MVC apps and ASP.NET Web Forms apps, is MVC has baked into it this idea of expressing intent in your controllers and not actually executing stuff. So you have an old web form, you have a button click, when they click on that button, something happens, and they redirect off to another page. If you want to automate the testing of that button click, you have somewhat of a problem, because how are you going to automate the actual response.redirect that you're doing? That's general just executing and going. Now, that's not to say web forms aren't testable. I've done it before. I work at a company where our current code base is mostly web forms. We're moving to ASP.NET MVC in most of our little apps and whatnot, and we want to move it into our primary app, and in some of our primary apps in the company, we've moved to it. But you can make web forms testable. It's just harder. And one of the ways that MVC does this is by the expression of intent, and that has to do with the action result. And we'll see this in action. We'll see this in action here in just a minute. Also, one of the basic ideas that is not necessarily in MVC, but is a very important idea for testing, is to break down your controllers, especially, and this is the MVC part, break down your controllers into small little bitty pieces. And so don't have humongous controllers where all the logic for doing everything that controllers need is in that controller itself. That's going to make it very hard to test. However, what you should do is instead have other classes that class uses, that controller uses to do most of its work. That allows you to make the web layer of an ASP.NET MVC application much easier to test. And so those are the basic ideas. Now let's jump into some code. I will now share my desktop. All right, I hope everybody can see that. I'll assume so unless you tell me otherwise. So here's our application. If anybody wants this bit of sample code later, you just let me know. I'll probably put it up on the web, and if I do, I'll put a note out on my Twitter account. So this is the app that we're going to be working with. Let's take a quick look at it. All right, here it is in all of its wonderful glory. Wow, changing resolution has really affected my menu options, but still they're viewable. So what we have here is we have a home page, and then there's several different pages and functions we're going to test. Right now, they're not implemented, which is, boom, why we get this big, fat, not implemented exception. We're going to implement them, and we're going to test them here in just a minute. So that's the basic idea. Now, if we look at the code, it's fairly straightforward. We've got normal controller code here. Of course, all the implementation is commented out. We're throwing not implement exceptions here. The views are exactly where you would expect them. Here's my views that I'm going to be testing with. I've got a view model here that I can't even remember if I'm still even using. And then we've got some code that we're going to get into later. And just in general, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about view results and JSON results first. We're going to talk about dependency injection and making it easier for you to test things. We're going to talk about extending the test to cut down on the code you end up writing in your test. We're going to talk about organizing your test, and then we're going to get into little things that are a little more difficult to test, like session. And we're going to talk about also how to integrate structure map into your application in a very basic way to give you nice, testable, much easier to test in composed controllers. So that's essentially where we're going in terms of a roadmap. So let's start with a basic view result. So this is our test to view function right here. And because I'm assuming all of you have seen something about MVC. This is not your first talk because you're actually talking about testing ASP.NET MVC. And so we're not going to start with the implementation. We will start with the testing first. So I have this test class for testing the controller. Of course, it doesn't do anything yet because we haven't implemented them. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a test for this particular action result, a very simple test. So I'm going to follow this particular testing style. And this is the naming I generally do. And there are exceptions, but generally do. And this is a naming style I picked up from The Art of Unit Testing by Roy Osherov, a great book. I highly recommend it. And so on our samples controller, the action name is test of view. So I'm going to be testing test of view. Usually what you'll do in this standard is you would put perhaps inputs, or you'd put a statement about the conditions. Here I don't really have any inputs or conditions. I'm going to just test that a view result returns. So regular view, and I'm going to say returns view. So I'm going to test that I'm actually getting a view result back. So let's put my attribute on there. And I'm using right now for ease MS Test. It's really easy to use. I normally in my own projects use NUnit. At work we're using MS Test. They work almost exactly the same. There are differences, and NUnit has some kind of nice features. But really, the basic functionality of how to test ASP.NET MVC apps does not matter between NUnit or MBUnit or this. If you're going to go to a different style of testing, like behavior-driven development, then you might be rethinking some things. But in general, we're talking about automated unit tests, and it doesn't really matter which framework you use. So let's start this off. Var controller equals new samples controller. And the method we want on this guy is testing a view. Okay? So this thing is going to return an action result. So what I'm going to do coming out of it, because action result, as you probably know, is the base class, I'm going to go ahead and cast that to what I'm expecting. So I'm going to say as a view result. And then to test that I actually got a view result back, is I want to say assert.is not null result expected a view result. Okay, I'm going to run this, and in terms of testability, one thing I've noticed is that the test runner in Visual Studio for MS Test is much slower than if you run them through testdriven.net. Testdriven.net is a great little plugin. It looks like this. If you got it, you get this little rocket here. If you run tests with it, it tends to actually run faster. I've got Control-T to really make it go fast. So I've got Control-T to run my test, and I'm going to fail because I would expect a not implemented exception. And there we go. Returns through exception, not implemented exception. So we've got a failure. So we're going to go here, and now we're going to implement this guy. And of course, if we were to actually go to the page, it would blow up. Yada, yada. So let's actually implement something. Right now, we're not going to mess with this data piece that we're going to talk about in a minute. Right now, we're just going to return the view. And then, let's run it. We passed. And really, what does this get you? Not a whole lot. In this case, there's no logic to be done here. So in this case, it's questionable. But if you're, for example, making a request to a particular route and you're saying you might return a redirect or you might return a view result or you might return a view result by a particular name or another name, then in that case, then it becomes very, very useful. And so, for example, if you have foo versus bar view names that you want to return, that would be where you could check the name and confirm that. And so it would look something like this. And so we're going to say foo. It should do something like are equal foo. We expect a foo. We're going to result dot view name. Let's see. So that's how you would test that. So if you're testing foo versus bar. But as it is right now, we're just returning a view. So here's where the distinction between actual execution and intent of execution is very important. Because when you look at this action method from just the perspective of what's going on with the controller, you might think is whenever you execute this view method, it returns HTML. Like it takes that view model, which is just a class I'm marrying up to view, it takes it and returns HTML. Actually, it doesn't. It doesn't do that at all. What it does is it returns a view result. If you look in the IntelliSense here, you've got view result that it's returning, which is a subclass of action result. And so what you're doing is you're telling the framework, hey, framework, render this view, specifically the one, since I didn't specify a name, called test view. Render that view with this object. And so the framework will do that. Because the framework is going to do that later, you can now test the logic in your actual method without having to worry about parsing through HTML and figuring out if everything got rendered correctly. And this is important because you also want to separate, for your just basic unit testing, your basic logic testing, you want to separate having to test everything. Instead of doing that, go down to test just what code you wrote, right? You didn't write the code for taking that view model and matching it up with the view and actually rendering. You didn't write that code. That's Microsoft's job. They're testing that. You don't need to. Same with the validation. If you use their validation stuff, they built that. You don't really need to test it. Though if you want to find a way to do it, feel free to do so. But primarily what you're testing in this scenario is your logic in that controller. And this allows you to do that because it's returning back its intent to show a view, not an actual view. So that goes back to that whole intent thing. So that's basically how you would do a view. Now, that's kind of not realistic in terms of a real world, because usually whenever we're building a web app, we're doing that to return data. And so we want to actually return something. So let's do that. I have a class. Look at my code. It is very complicated. This getAstring returns a string, which is really just a random number. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this, just so we have something to work with. I'm going to say data repository equals new data repository. So now whenever the constructor, whenever the controller is newed up, it's automatically going to new up this dependency and then execute it. which is kind of nice, but actually has real problems. And we'll talk about how to fix this problem in just a minute with dependency injection. So what this is doing then is going to return that. And what I want to do here is, well, we're not going to test that piece anymore. So let's test this to make sure we're still running and passing. Okay, we are. So I'm going to say, all right, so we can watch ourselves fail. Let's test that, turn that guy off. We can say search is not null. I'm going to assert that the result, getting ahead of myself, sorry. So we're using a view model in this case, right? And so the view result has this model that's being returned. So let's get that guy out. So let's say result.viewData.model has, what did I call that thing? I called that a test of view model. Test of view model. Test of view model. That's a great name. There we go. So we're going to get that guy back. We're going to get the model out because he stored his object, and we're going to cast him to that. Then we're going to say assert.isNotNull. We're going to say the VM because we want to make sure we actually got that type, right? Because if you cast to a type that it isn't, you just get a null. So expected A. Oh. And now we're going to test that the property on that view model, some data, is not null. All right, this should fail because we haven't, we unimplemented that piece. And so, well, we expected data. So if we go back, we get it, and that's cool. So, oops, I just hit F5. Not what I intended. Let's go back and debug. Stop debugging. All right. Now we're passing. And look at all the individual things we are testing in this case. First, we are testing that a view result actually came back. We're testing that the view model sent down for the view is of a certain type. That's what we're doing, and that it exists, that somebody actually signed it. And we're testing the actual data on that model. And so this gives you a really nice way of testing everything that you need to come back. Let's say you have a page, and that page has 40 data items on it. Now, that would be a heinous test, but you could, with this method, test that you're getting back data for all of those things. Like I said, heinous to check 40 items, but you could do it. What more often happens is there's a much smaller set of data, and then you just go through and you test those, and it's fairly straightforward. So now let's talk about dependency injection. And so one of the less than ideal things here is sometimes you actually expect a particular piece of data to come back, not just a particular random piece of data. And so you want to be able to say, okay, in this X condition, I want Y data to come back. In this particular case, you're totally hosed. And the reason why you're totally hosed is right now we have no control in the context of the test of this data. This get a string. Is it going to return 1,000? Is it going to return 486? Who knows? Because right now, it's just random. And I want to control that for my test for whatever reason. So let's talk about how to do that. The way we're basically going to do it is dependency injection. The easiest way to do that at this point is to do it like this. And later on, we'll talk about how to use structure map to do this, which makes it even a little bit easier. But for now, this will work. So we're just going to create a public property for data repository, like so. And let's actually, at this point, switch it to the interface that the repository implements, because that's going to make it a little bit easier here in a second. So on the get, you're going to return the data repository. On the set, data repository equals value. All right. So this is very simple, but what this allows you to do then is then swap out this guy. And so let's do this. Let's change this assert, just for grins, are equal to, I'm going to say 50. Now, it's still a random number, and so that's not going to be true except for very infrequently, but let's see what happens. So, some data, wrong data. There's our message. All right. So we're going to run this. This is, I'm sure, going to fail. We're going to say, okay, what's wrong with this guy? And it's going to say, wrong data. Expected 50, 617. We run it again. It's expected 50, actual 556. So let's now use dependency injection to solve that problem. And so what we need to do is we need to basically take control of this guy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a simple stub for this guy. And I'll actually create him as a inner class here. So public class data repository stub. I want to implement iData repository. All right. So then, let's see, get a string. I want it to return 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Let's get rid of these nice regions that Studio added. So I wanted to return 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So now it's always going to actually return what I want. So the way you would then use dependency injection to get this to the controller is this. You would say controller.data repository equals new data repository stub. Now we should be getting a a result of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 each time we do it. Now, whenever you're actually running the application, in this particular case, this should work now that we've actually implemented things. There it is. Okay, so, hey, let's do test view. So here's that random number that's coming out. And so in the actual running of the application, you're getting the actual values. But in the test, you get controlled values given what you're telling it to start expecting. This is very important in the test. Randomness in tests and random failings will utterly kill your confidence in your own tests. You've got to kill those out. And what this will do, just the basic idea of dependency injection will allow you to control all of that. So let's keep that class around. Let's go a little further. Let's try another test. And so we've got on here, hey, while we were here, let's test some JSON. So this is a method. And what this does is this, let's go look at that view. Testing a view. All right, so on this button click, we're going to call test a JSON result, get that back, and then do an alert based on the value that comes back. So if we go back to our controller, this is the test a JSON result. And so we'll get to the implementation here in a second. So let's go to here. We're going to do this. Public void test view, regular view, returns, excuse me, not test a view, we're testing the JSON result. No inputs, returns JSON. All right, test method, here we go. So we actually aren't using our data stub, so we don't really need it in this case. So here's our controller. So our controller, we're going to say test JSON result. And this is, we want a JSON result to come back. So we're going to say, we're going to expect a JSON result, var result equals this. So now let's put that rather boring code, which we'll talk about in a minute how to get rid of. So is not null, result, expected a JSON result. There's that. Now what we want to do is we want to var vm equals results.data. So whenever you return a JSON result back, the actual object that you're telling the framework to serialize into JSON for you comes back in this property. And so then we're going to cast it as whatever we plan on doing, which I think is foo. We have a class called foo. It's a very special class, and it has a single property called name. So we're going to get back a foo, and we're going to say assert.r equal Frank. We're going to say that the name is going to be Frank, so we're going to say vm.name is Frank, wrong name is our message if it fails. So let's run this guy. It failed. The reason why is, once again, we're going to get a not implemented exception. So if we go here, and let's just uncomment as it is, it has the wrong name, so it will still fail. So just so you look at it, here's our view model that we're returning back to our JSON, and we're returning that. We're saying, okay, we're going to allow a get on this in this particular case, but we're saying, hey, return a JSON result and serialize this view model into JSON for the client. Now, in this particular case, just like with the view, we don't have to parse through the JSON to make sure we got it. What we're doing is we're parsing the result. Parsing the JSON would work, would just be kind of annoying. But in this case, we're just going to assume the framework and turn it into JSON, and then just test on the fact that we got it. So we didn't have Bubba in there. We've had Frank in our test, Bubba in the code, so this is going to fail. Expected Frank. We're going to get Bubba. Let's go back here. Change this to Frank. Also, something for your testing workflow. I've got control team mapped to run a test for test-driven.net. I have control shift T attached to rerun your last test. And so I can, from this context, make the change, rerun it, and assuming you can see the bottom left-hand corner of my screen, you can see that it passed. And so that's how you would test a JSON result. And if you needed to inject data, which you probably would, you would do it exactly the same way that we did it with the view controller. Now let's talk about organizing this stuff. And so we've got not very much at this point, but at least a little bit of shared code between these controller methods. In this case, it's not too heinous. But if you ever have to do a lot of setup for a controller for it to get all the expected data that you need, that's when having a separate method for doing the setup versus the actual testing is very useful. So let's just see what that would look like. So I'm going to create the method called setup, and we're going to put this test initialize attribute on it. What that means is whenever you run one of these tests, it's going to run this guy before it runs the test, which means any setup you do here is going to get run. So some things that would be useful to share across all the tests for this controller would be, first of all, the controller itself. So let's get rid of that guy as something instantiated for each method. So let's make him private. Here's my naming standard, underscores for privates. So we're going to say, there you go. So now we can then kill this line out of this test. So in this case, we're not really doing much because, well, now we will because we'll instantiate the controller here. All right. So let's run our tests and make sure everything passes. Does. Fantastic. Next thing we'll want to do often, because most of them are going to use our data repository, assuming that we only have one for this controller, but most of them would end up using it, is then I would go back and I'd say, okay, let's do this. Let's have a private data or just data repository stub repo. So we're going to say repo equals new data repository stub. And then I'm going to say controller dot data repository equals now our stub repository. And so now this is set up for all of our tests here in our controller test. And so now I don't have to do that each time, which is kind of nice. Now another thing we're going to want to do often in these is instead of doing this, create a stub like this that returns exactly that, because you may use the same stub in multiple tests. You might want to do something like this. So public string get a string return value. And so you can set it on an individual test level and still maintain that global setup and the initialize for just the basics. And so if we do this, now the call to get a string will be whatever you set here. So in our test here, we can say repo dot get a string return value equals 3, 4, 5. Oops, I lost my position in the file. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That right there makes for a little bit better test organization. Now, another thing that you're going to want to do as you start writing a lot of tests, I don't know how many of you have written a lot, how many of you haven't. One thing that I found is very helpful is to start extending the testing itself. And so here's one particular problem that really annoys me. And this is to test that I got a particular type of a result back. First of all, I'm casting it to right here, and then I'm doing the cert null check. What I'd much rather do is just put that in just one line, and so for every test, I can do that. And really, typing out this message is really annoying, because for every method, it's going to be exactly the same for its return type. Expected to JSON result, expected to view result. So let's extend our testing here to make this a little bit easier. So let's create a new class in our test app here. We're going to call it test extensions. So we're going to use extension methods to do this. Public static class, we're going to create a public static void, actually not void, we're going to make a test specific for view results. So we're going to say view result, bring in ASP.NET MVC, verify view result. And what we want to do is we want to attach this to action result, like so. And so, let's see, how do we want to do this? Well, I guess there's multiple ways, but just very easily, we're going to say var casted result equals result as view result. Assert dot is not null. So we're basically taking that same logic, which I'll just take that logic out of that and make sure that we got that view result. Then return a casted result. Okay? Very easy. So now up here we can do, instead of all of this, and do notice this also casts it for you. This checks to make sure you got the proper type, and because it's casted already, it just returns that, which allows you to here to verify view result. And this is already cast to a view result for you and is already tested, and so you can just get rid of this line entirely. And so that is really very nice. You could do something very similar here for the model, where you could then say, you can make this generic or even pass in a type if you wanted to, where you could say, okay, verify model type, where it would then cast it as that model here, and so you wouldn't have to do this second check right here. So that right there is going to cut down this is cut down in every single one of my view tests, one line of code. And that is a lot of lines of code over time. And so do that. Then you would make a specific one for JSON. Or instead, you could just make a generic one where you pass in whichever type of result, and then you just vary your message based on the type passed in, if you want to go that way as well. That's up to you. It's up to however flexible you want to be and how you want to implement it. But the idea is basically fairly simple. Cut down on your test code, and there's less to look at, because this is very clear. Verify view result. This does it all for me. All right, so also in terms of organizing, for the most part, I would recommend having a single test class for any major set of setup. So let's say you have 10 tests over a controller. 5 of those tests have one rather complex set of setup, and another several have a different rather complex set of setup. Instead of having both of those in this one test class, and then having a setup method which is doing 2 separate things for 2 separate sets of tests, break it into 2 separate classes. And that way the initialize fits with all of the tests within that controller, or excuse me, within that particular controller test class. So that would definitely be something that I think is important whenever you get to more complicated controllers. Of course, sometimes if your controllers are that complicated, that's just a sign that your controllers are too complicated, and you should need to break them up and get several controllers out of the thing. So there you go. And so the way this essential way of going about basically works for pretty much every type of action result. If we have time later, I'll show how to test a redirect and a redirect to action result, but really it's more of the same. And so, it's just instead of view result, redirect result, and yada, yada, yada. So that's that. And so instead of doing that, though, I'm going to move on to something else. And so one thing I really like about ASP.NET MVC is this particular part of the testing. One thing I definitely do not like about ASP.NET MVC is how much harder it is to test things like session. So let's say you want to test that something is in session, or you want to test a method that has a dependency on session. Okay? Let me give you a sample. And so I have this test here of testing session. All right? Here's my foo. I'm using my foo class again. It's going to get a name out of session, and then it's going to return the view. All right? All right, so if we go back to our, didn't mean to open Outlook. Okay, so if we go to home, just because I needed to do it somewhere, I put in my home controller this, where if you visit the index action, you're getting that value in there. So if I go here, this session page is then going to use that value. Apparently I didn't click on it. Oh, also, I have to remove that. Yeah, that's not going to work. All right. There we go. Okay, so since I needed to rebuild, since I just rebuilt, let me do this again. Go back to home. Now go back to session, and we're working like a charm. Fantastic. So here's our method. Now, this is actually a real problem for testing. So if we go here to this controller test here, if we really want to pimp out how all of this session stuff works and this request stuff works, you have to do a lot more than you have to do with testing action results. And that is, you have to start creating like mock classes that basically replace everything in HTTP context and HTTP session. Now, there are also already some sample libraries out there that help do this for you. MVC Contrib used to have something in it. It probably still does. If I remember right, based on Rhino-Mox for doing this. I'm going to show you just the basics of how to create one manually and how that works. So what about sessions? So if you go to a test, and you want to replace the whole bit of session, so let's say public void test session page, or what do we call that? Let's see, testing session. As session value returns view with session value. So that's actually what we want to test, that we're getting that back. If you look at our controller, if you want to, let's say, change out the entire session hash table, well, too bad, because right there it's a get. It's not a get set, so you can't just assign session to it. And so that's not quite that straightforward. So if you want to do something like that, you would go essentially this route. I created some classes called mock classes here, and what these are doing is these are inheriting off of the base classes. And this is one of the major differences between old school ASP.NET and ASP.NET MVC. And I think they've actually changed this in ASP.NET 4. I haven't messed around with ASP.NET 4 much at all, but with MVC, they went, instead of using HTTP context and HTTP result, what they're doing is they based it all on base classes, HTTP context base, and, for example, HTTP session state base. What this allows you to do, and this was very nice of them, was you can then inherit from these guys. You can inherit from these guys, override them, and then implement these things however you want to do it. So in the context of our test, and let's say we want to replace all that session stuff, you could do something like this: HTTP context base. I created, this class, so we're going to say, excuse me, it's my mock.create. It's going to create that class, and it's also inside of it creating that session, if you look at it. So it's instantiating this and passing in a session mock. And my session mock has my nice little generic hash table in it. So then I can say context.session, then I can say name equals, let's say I don't do that yet. Let's run the test and see what happens. So var ctrl equals, wait a minute, we have it. We can do that testing session. Just running this without actually doing anything, we're going to see that it fails. And the reason why it fails is we're going to have an object reference not set to an instance of an object, which is because right here nothing is put in session. And so it's very angry about that. So we're going to solve that by doing this. We're going to say context.session. So this is our mocked up session right here. We're going to give it a name of foo. And so let's see. The next thing we want to do is we need to associate this now with the controller. So we're going to say controller.controller context equals new controller context, which then comes with a context, which then you need to pass it in route data. In this case, the actual code doesn't look at any of the routes for the execution of the actual method, so you do that. And then you pass in the controller, and you're probably thinking, wow, this doesn't sound like much fun. And it actually isn't. This is it's actually kind of annoying. So that right there will set up our session. So now we can actually run it. We should be able to run it without it blowing up. And so then at that point, you would then go back to what we were doing before. So we're going to verify that that's a view result, and you would get your view model back, and then we would make sure that the name was set to whatever we put in session. And in a sense, this is dependency injection, where we're injecting this new session in that has these values, and so it would work just like above. So that to me is doable as long as you abstract it into a set of classes and you can reuse those. That takes a lot of the pain out. And really, if we want to take our initialize method to 11, that's where you would do this kind of thing as well. So this right here is actually setting it up. So for your actual test, a little bit more we got to do here. Context. And so we actually need to make this available and callable by the other test method. So here's our context right here. So here, and this would allow us to still in one line make our setup for this particular test and run it. So this is still workable. It's not like you can't do it. It's just, it's a little bit more work if you want to actually replace the whole session stuff and the request stuff and response and do that. And of course, what you'd really end up doing over time is not just mocking out session. You'd be mocking out request. You'd be mocking out response. You'd be mocking out probably the cache as well, blah, blah, blah. So that's all there is I want to say about that, because it's basically all that exercise over again to get it to where you need it to do. Workable, but not utterly awesome. So now let's move on to something else. And like I said before, if you have any questions about any of this, just stop me. Just ask a question. I'll keep my eye on that, and we'll talk about it. So I want to really now make our dependency injection a lot better, not only for testing, but also for just basic composition, just to control things. Because we've all seen the 3,000-line ASPX page code behinds, right? We've seen those, and hopefully we all detest them equally. Of course, we still end up writing them somehow, but still, hopefully we all detest them. So we would not want to see this guy balloon into that. And so instead of, actually doing our data access or whatever, we have a data repository. This controls and encapsulates all of the data logic that this controller needs. Whether you want to have one generic data repository, which might get kind of big, or a bunch of little ones, that's fine. Now, I, though, want to take away some of this stuff. Like, this manual process certainly works. This is the way I used to do it, and it is a decent and workable solution. It really does work fine. Instead of doing this, when I get the controller, I want it already set up for me via passing in something into the constructor. Because if the samples controller needs a data repository, well, darn it, I'd like to have one in the constructor, so whenever this thing is constructed for the first time, it runs exactly the way it should. And so we're going to switch to doing that. And the way you do that in MVC is you then take over the controller factory. Because the way it works is the request comes in, it parses out the route based on your URL, it figures out the controller it needs, and asks the framework, hey, default controller factory, please give me controller samples in this particular case. He looks, he says, hey, I've got a samples controller. I'll give them to you. And he instantiates them and returns them back to you. However, if we want to pass stuff into the constructor of samples controller, we're going to need to do something else to manage that. And so what I'm going to do right here is I'm going to hook up, in a very basic manner, structure map to do that for me. And so I'm going to get rid of this property. Well, of course, that's going to make my test blow up, but we'll go back and we'll fix that. Then I'm going to say public samples controller. It's going to take an iData repository. And data repository is going to go there, and then I can get rid of this. And so now, of course, we're going to need to change our test. And by the way, this is also a pretty decent argument for also doing this setup like this, because what we can do is, instead of changing all of the tests to deal with this new dependency, we can put it in right here. Repo. So we have 3 tests, but we only have to change one spot in code in the test code because it's well organized, and we've got all of that back up to date. And so now if we run this page, it's going to blow chunks horribly. And the reason why is because, well, what are we going to do about this guy? Because we need this guy. Have I not built him? Data repository, we're using him. One second. All right, the reason why is when I was working on the sample earlier, I accidentally left structure map set up. That's funny. All right, so now let me turn off structure map. That was a pretty goofball. All right. So now if you don't turn off structure map, see, that was utterly confusing. If you don't turn off structure map, it's not going to have its dependency, and therefore you're going to get this problem. No parameterless constructor defined for this object. And if you look at what's going on here, what is causing this problem? You've got your system.web.mvc default controller factory, get controller instance. This guy's trying to find an instance of controller based on this name, samples. It's trying to create it. Oh gosh, we've got all sorts of problems because I'm going to call the default constructor. Oh gosh, I can't because it doesn't exist. And so that is why that ultimately won't work. And so what you have to do to set up structure map as your controller factory is this. First of all, you change your default controller factory, or your current controller factory, away from what is normally used to what is you call a structure map controller factory. That's what I call it. And then you're going to tell structure map, hey, scan the assembly, and with default conventions, figure out how everything works out. And what that basically works out to is it sees an iData repository, and it also sees this guy, and it says, oh, okay, well, when somebody asks for an iData repository, I'm just going to give them this guy. So that's how that's going to work. And it's, obviously a little more complicated than the scenes, but in terms of just the basic takeaway, that's how that works. And so if you go look at the structure map controller factory, it's really simple. It's try to get the controller from the object factory, which is something from structure map. So try to get the controller from there and then return it. And structure map is going to create that controller for you and inject all of your dependencies. Now this is particularly useful if, let's say, your controllers, so your controller takes iData repository. Let's say that guy takes an iLogger. And so instead of then just passing in a stub for iRepository, you have to create some sort of stubbing mechanism for iLogger to create the stub for iData repository to then to stick into samples controller. Or for the normal, for the normal running of the app, you're going to have to set all that up. What structure map will do for you is it will basically see these interfaces, construct all of that for you, and basically say, okay, here you go, voila, you've got this nice, easy dependency setup, big dependency tree you don't have to create. It's going to do it for you. And so this is all you got to do. You say set it up. We say make it the new controller factory, and you're done. It's passing this guy in, which is great. So that's how you set up structure map. And now, of course, the tests don't change because the tests aren't using structure map. The tests are just passing in stuff into the constructor. It's your ASP.NET MVC app, which is using structure map to manage its dependencies. Where in the test, you manage them manually because you need to be able to set them up and get the expectations that you want. So that's that. Well, we have 8 minutes. I am open for questions. I can do a redirect result and a redirect to route result too to finish out our time. But if you have questions, I would rather answer those. So bring them up if you do. Until then, I'll start implementing something. And being the nice guy that I am, I'll talk about it as I go. So let's do redirect to route. Void. We want to test this guy. Test a redirect to route guy. So no inputs, returns, redirect to home page. So we're going to go back to the home page of the site with this test. Okay, we have a question in the QA. All right, so here's the question. And instead of reading it, because I don't know if you guys can see that window or not, so I'll just post it right here. Hi, Eric. I would like to know about JSON result tests. You were able to check values or just if the type that was returned is JSON. And so here's what's going on with the JSON results. You go back up to here. So remember that the JSON result itself is an expression of intent. Whenever you return from the method in your controller, you have not at that point actually generated JSON. That's what the framework is going to do. If you want to test the actual generated JSON, you're going to go to something like a web test that will actually generate it for you. In this particular case, we're not doing that. Our goal is whenever we return the JSON result, we want to find out exactly what that stuff was that got turned back. And so if you want to check the actual values, you can do what we did here and then check the name. If you want to check the actual JSON, you're moving into a different area, and that is web testing. So this is how you would check the values outside of a web test. Inside of a web test, it just depends on the framework you're using. If that did not answer your question, please post a follow-up, and I will answer that. And anybody else, I'll answer any questions you may have as well. All right, so the redirect to home page. We're going to say controller.redirect, test a redirect to route as redirect to route result. And so when you do a redirect to action, it's not creating something called a redirect to action result. It's creating something called a redirect to route result. And that will basically hold all the route values that you push in the controller and pass them back for you to test. All right, so we do have more questions. Let's see. My boss thinks checking values makes tests too brittle. Any thoughts? They absolutely do if you don't control the values. So if you're not doing dependency injection, and let's say you actually have your unit test set up to query from the database, that is going to add some brittleness to your test. Now, that's not to say that that's not ever a bad idea. Like, for example, if you have a essentially static configuration that changes only very rarely, but the code on top of it might change sometimes, doing an integration test that pulls that data is a fantastic idea. However, if that data changes a lot and the code on top of it changes a lot, you're going to create very brittle tests with that because the tests are going to just fail every time somebody changes data or changes code. So it really just depends on the case. However, in this particular case right here, where I'm setting up the actual dependency that goes and gets the data, I don't see much of a case where you'd get brittleness here because you're controlling it all. You essentially are controlling the variables, and that's the key principle. If you control the variables, data tests are not a problem. If you don't control the variables, they are a huge problem because, getting back to what I said earlier, if you have tests that randomly fail, for whatever reason, environmental reasons, blah, blah, blah. If you have those, then you're going to stop paying attention when some of those tests fail, because you're like, okay, well, I expect 1% of all of these tests to fail occasionally, and so when 1% fails, you never pay attention. But what if it's actually a real failure that is new? Well, you would only know that if you looked, but you stopped looking because it was redundant. So he's right in certain circumstances. So it really just depends on the case and how you're doing it all. Hope that makes sense. That's been my experience so far, and it seems to be working out for me. Brittleness has not been as much of an issue. I mean, integration tests to me, though, are always going to be more brittle, because integration by its very nature throws in more variables. And when you throw in more variables, you have lots of more things that can change, and therefore your tests are going to fail more often. Now, hopefully, most of those failures are important. Hopefully you don't have to, it's just, oh, I got to go update that test again. Yeah. So, okay, no more questions, so I'll go on to this guy. We have 2 minutes. So I'm not going to check my null here just because, well, we're running out of time. So I'm going to say, okay, result, because it's a redirect result, has route values. And in this, let's say you have an action. So you have a redirect result. We're gonna hope that the action coming out is index, because we want to send it to the index of the home controller. So we're going to say to string, to lower, not to look up, to lower. We're actually about to have our keynote, our lunch keynote. So we're going to run this test. Of course, it still fails at the very least because we haven't actually implemented it, and we have that exception being thrown right here. So I'm going to rerun my test. And in this case, it passed because it checked to see that index was coming back out. And so that's how you would check redirect to routes. And because we're out of time, redirect to just plain old URLs, that works in the same way. You just check the redirect URL that's coming back out and make sure it's exactly what you would expect. And, of course, redirect to routes, just to specify the difference between the two, you would redirect to a route or an action within the context of your own application, because you've got your routes defined and you're sending them there. You would redirect to just a redirect URL whenever you're going outside of your site, where you don't have any routes set up because that's not your site. So that's the difference between the two. All right, I am going to officially turn this off. If anybody wants to continue the discussion, like I said, email me. Thanks, guys.
This presentation was recorded at MVCConf. For more content like this, go to www.mvcconf.com.